Hi, I'm Nancy Fishman, and on behalf of the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival, I'm really thrilled to have an opportunity to speak with Nate Levy, who is the director of Those Who Heard and Those Who Saw. Welcome to our digital Q&A. Nate, we're really happy to have an opportunity to talk to you about this film.
It's my pleasure.
It's my pleasure.
Yay!
I thought I'd start off and ask you
about the genesis of the film.
You're not Canadian.
I think that's correct. You're from New Hampshire.
Can
you tell me how you first heard about the Jewish refugees in camps in Canada?
Actually, the way I found the story was by looking at maps, which is sort of how the film begins, by looking at some maps of Sherbrooke.
I often look at
maps for story ideas. I tend to find that places with interesting topographies often have interesting stories associated with them. And I'm from New Hampshire, and I've had a long-standing interest in Canada, and I've done a couple of different film projects there. And I was looking at a map of the border between New Hampshire and Canada, and saw this relatively large city named Sherbrooke that I really didn't know much about.
When I started
looking into the history of the city,
one of the first
things that came up was that this large internment camp had been built in Sherbrooke in 1940.
And
today there are the current influx of Syrian refugees to Sherbrooke as well.
I thought you did
an amazing job with a dearth of video material
because there were so few videos taken obviously inside the camps.
I think the exception was
there were some photos taken by
Siegler. What's his name? Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
And so
I noticed on your CV that you're the video production manager for the Obama presidency oral history project.
And I wanted to ask you if you could talk about the difference between oral histories on tape and film.
And also about how the scarcity of video materials led to your creative choices.
It's a great question. The interviews that I used were recorded in the early 70s by a man named Eric Koch, who had been an internee in Sherbrooke and a couple of the other camps. And to be honest, I think that those tapes I would not classify as oral history exactly. He had a pretty strong agenda that he was pursuing when he did those interviews, and they're very chummy. Actually, a lot of the interviews, he sort of like flips them on. He doesn't do a particularly in-depth introduction. He might not even mention who he's talking to. They're really sort of like his notes so that he could go back to them. And the work
that I do at Columbia is much more formal.
We're interested in creating
an archive that is quite large, a large sort of corpus of work that could be accessible to historians of the future. To be honest, the stuff that Eric captured is very compelling, but it can also often be very difficult to understand sort of like what's going on, who he's talking to, why he's talking to them.
And in terms of finding visuals, it was quite a challenge.
I went through a number of different sort of phases of thinking about what I thought the film should be like. When I started researching the camps themselves, it was clear that there were basically no monuments, nothing to really be seen at the camps, at the current sites. So I figured that I should try to incorporate that into the representation on screen by showing what isn't there. And as you said, there are a few photos that were taken sort of surreptitiously by one of the internees,
and
there was a film made by the Red Cross, a 16 millimeter film that shows one of the camps, but after it had been converted to a prisoner of war camp, and not while Jewish refugees were there, but shows some of the same buildings and stuff like that.
And I'm curious.
I'm curious with your work with the Obama presidency oral history project. Do they do anything just on audio tape, or is everything now video?
So the way that the project had initially been conceived of is we're doing about 500 interviews with 500 different individuals, and
most or many of those individuals get multiple sessions, some of them up to 3, and each session is about 2 hours each. And the original idea had been that the first 2 sessions would be just audio, and that the third session would be on camera, and that we would probably revisit some of the topics that had come up in the first 2 and get those on camera. Because of the pandemic, we now do everything on camera, and we do it all over Zoom. Which has provided its own challenges, but now we're pretty much committed to doing these all with video.
I felt like you could see that in your editing and the way you use the material that you had, that you were really experienced working with archival material. And I also loved how the moments where you kind of take us on the journey, like when you go to the archive and you see the woman bringing out this huge metal thing filled with archival files. I felt like you incorporated sort of the search or the thrill of the search. I was curious how many Canadians do you think, this is not necessarily a scientific question, but how many Canadians do you think know about the refugee camps for Jews and German POWs? And do you think do they teach it in school? Is this something that's widely known in the Canadian Jewish community?
I would say currently no. That it's not widely known. I think among Canadian Jews or among Canadians at large. In the 80s, there was a little flurry of work that was created. Some folks wrote dissertations about the camps. Eric Koch published his own book about the camps. And there was one sort of like brief CBC television film that was made. But as far as I know, that film is not accessible. You can't find it online. The dissertations are hard to get and are academic. And Eric's book has been out of print for many years. And there was an exhibition at a museum in Vancouver about the camps. 6 or 7 years ago, which collected a lot of material, physical objects from the camps. But I think it's interesting, that it's a museum in Vancouver that really picked that up and explored it. Whereas in Quebec itself, I think it's pretty unknown.
It was fascinating to me because I'm from the East Coast originally. I've done some work in the Jewish community, and I was completely unknown to me. So I think you've done, besides making a beautiful film, I think you've actually done a service of telling a story that a lot of people would be interested in learning about. I also loved how you interwove the stories of Jewish refugees in Canada with the contemporary story of a Syrian Muslim refugee, Muhammed Al Jabir, who's a refugee in Canada from Deir ez-Zor, which is a small Syrian city. Can you talk about how you met Muhammad and at what point you decided to integrate his story into the film?
Sure. When I had looked at this map of Sherbrooke, the story about the internment camps popped up. The most pressing thing when I was investigating it was this influx of refugees from Syria. Sherbrooke is it's a city, but it's a small city. And I think after Montreal and Quebec City, the sort of two largest, it has seen the highest percentage of Syrian refugees arriving. And initially that was actually what I thought would be the bulk of the film, that I would do a film really more about Syrian refugees and have the internment story sort of in the background. And over the course of the film, it sort of flipped. I went up to Sherbrooke at first without a camera, and I tried to make some contacts. I had arranged to meet with some folks from the largest mosque in Sherbrooke, and to be truthful, at first they were quite hesitant. Just a few months before I had visited, there was a shooting at a Quebec City mosque in which I think 6 people were killed. And they were concerned about some outsider, some non-Muslim coming into their space and wanting to bring a camera. And the first day that I arrived, they were actually talking about their own sort of security protocols, about the security camera and who had keys and what the locks were. It was really present. But I stayed for the better part of a day and made many trips back to that mosque and made friends with folks there. And Muhammad attends that mosque. And so I met him through that organization. And basically every time I went back up to Sherbrooke or back to Canada, I would spend a day or two with Muhammad and his family, either filming or just sort of hanging out.
I thought it brought the story into a very contemporary context, and I think a lot of Jewish organizations like HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Assistance Society. I hope I got that right. They've turned toward not only helping Jews but helping immigrants from all over the world. And I thought there was something. It sort of blew your film open in a way that was very, very moving to me. And I wanted to ask, did you think about including more than one contemporary refugee story, or what process you went through to decide to focus on Muhammad, who, by the way, I think was a great interview subject. And his family was great too. And his kids, I could have watched that his kid eat a strawberry for like hours.
They have a wonderful family. The truth is that I became really friends with Muhammad and his family. They've met both of my parents. We've had meals together, and my sense was that I could sort of expand it to multiple characters. But over the course of producing the film, it became clear to me that the story that was lesser known, and in a way. Needing to be surfaced at this time was the story of the Jewish refugee camps, and I wanted to focus mostly on that. There's obviously been quite a few films about Syrian refugees, and even quite a few films about Syrian refugees in Canada. And I basically wanted to put these, not equate these experiences, but put them into conversation. And to do that, I felt like I had to fill in quite a lot about the Jewish experience, because, as you pointed out, it's not well known. And so it was really kind of an issue of both time in the film and my closeness with Muhammad and his family.
And did you? I think it's completely understandable that this was not in the scope of the film. But I'm just out of my own personal curiosity. Did you talk to him at all about the story of the Jewish refugees, or did that resonate for him at all?
I took him to the site of the internment camp. We walked around, and I think it did. I don't want to speak for him, but I think for both of us, you walk around the site in Sherbrooke, which is currently just a bus depot where they drop off school buses and charter buses. And it's hard to put into words, but you can feel that there's sort of like this presence there that extends beyond sort of like its current use. And there is some resonance with the way he sort of feels about his hometown, Derazur, where I think he describes it at one point as a city of ghosts. And there's this way in which the bus depot itself is sort of like laden with this like ghostly character that I think we both felt as we were walking around there.
Yeah. I think you feel the weight of history in your film. So I thought your script was full of some very thought-provoking observations about history, and who gets to tell history, and how both physical structures and absences are part of history. And I was curious if you'd studied history, or if other historical projects prepared you for making this film.
I worked as a video producer at the Jewish Daily Forward, and many of our projects were sort of about Jewish history or informed by Jewish history. In terms of this film, and in terms of finding things that a lack of visual source material, one thing that I was interested in were sort of avant-garde filmmakers who have focused on physical space, and so there's people like Chantal Ackerman, but also a Japanese filmmaker now named Masao Adachi, whose landscape films sort of speak to this idea that the built environment actually tells us something about human life, even if there are no humans sort of represented on screen. And I wanted to apply that idea to these non-existent camps. And in terms of historical research, that's sort of like my thing. I love going into archives. I love tracking down photos and piecing together stories based on written and photovisual material. Often makes it hard for me because there's often a lack of video, but I love coming into contact with unknown stories and history in that way.
We're lucky to go on the journey with you. I also appreciated the use of archival footage from the film Snowshoers by Michel. I'm going to butcher the name Michel Brawl and Gil Gould. Which is really a great example of Canadian cinema verite documentary filmmaking. And I wanted to know what other cinema verite filmmakers have influenced you besides the two landscape, Chantal Ackerman and Adachi.
I guess to be honest, the verite stuff is like less my background. I think. At least for this film, essay filmmakers like Chris Marker and Haroon Farouki were sort of like largely significant. I have a good friend named Donald Foreman who recently did a essay film about his relationship with his father and the troubles in Northern Ireland. But for my part, I actually think the sort of like strict cinema verite or direct cinema traditions that's associated with Quebec and with France are less interesting to me now than maybe were at one point. I like when filmmakers take a stance, and it's clear that they're representing their own sort of beliefs and formulating their own opinions. And I think oftentimes verite, we think about it as like speaking to some sort of like objective truth, and really I think it's more. It's just as opinionated as like an essay film, but it sort of obfuscates that opinion in this way. That's right.
That's interesting. I was fascinated that Eric Koch started making these interviews in the 1970s. And I thought about often I did some interviews with Holocaust survivors in San Francisco when I first moved there with an oral history project. And I think often it takes people many years to kind of start talking about these issues. It seems like he started making these interviews in the 1970s, and I think that it's clear that Canadian Jews, like American Jews, had an assimilationist tendency. It's very poignant when he says, "I wanted to be Canadian. I didn't want to be a refugee." So I'm curious. This is also completely opinion and not necessarily based on historical knowledge. Do you think Canadian Jews were more or less or just as assimilationist as American Jews?
I don't know if I can speak generally about all Canadian Jews. I would say that for the men in these camps who became Canadian citizens, there's an interesting thing that goes on, and it's tricky to talk about because in some ways it contradicts what they say. But
I think that
when they got out
of these camps,
sort of like the political, social context of Canada was not particularly rosy. Canada had a very poor record when it came to admitting refugees during the Second World War. It was
just a few thousand.
Made it in. The federal government was extremely xenophobic and did their best to keep Jews out.
So when these
men got out of the camp, it was not assured that they were going to be able to stay in Canada.
And I think one
thing that happened is even though they had lived through a really traumatic and in times horrific experience, they didn't want to talk about it in that context. They wanted to talk about it as it taking them from being boys and turning them into men who love hockey and maple syrup, and they were lumberjacks. They wanted to become Canadian in this way.
And I think
that
in a way, this
was a survival mechanism. To choose to focus on those elements of the story help them maintain a certain security in Canada. There were fascist parties in Canada. There were anti-Semitic groups that organized boycotts against Jewish businesses. The Catholic Church at that time was incredibly anti-Semitic and even argued against Canada joining the Allies in World War II.
And those men would have known
all of that. And so they would have understood that it sort of was in their interest
to keep their head down.
I think over time, that story that they told about their experiences focusing on the good became the one that they shared more broadly.
And then the second
element is that most of the men who ended up staying in Canada were upper middle class or even from wealthy families. Many of them spoke multiple languages. Many of them spoke English before they got to Canada, and they had all spent time in the UK already.
So when they were
released from the camp, they found it quite easy to sort of assimilate. They weren't struggling to speak the language, for example, and had some sort of professional experiences before they went in.
So in terms of
American Jews versus Canadians, I don't know, but I would say that
the men in these camps
had particular reasons why they wanted to assimilate that I think are often not captured in their own narration of that history.
That's interesting.
I was also fascinated that some of these camps held both German and Italian POWs and Jews at the same time. And I think one of the most chilling moments in the film is when one of the refugees says he heard the Germans singing, something like "I can't wait until our knives spurt Jewish blood or something like that." And I wanted to know if there had been any books or studies done besides Eric Koch's Deemed Suspect about sort of this commingling.
There have been,
as I said, dissertations written about the camps that address both the refugee experience and the prisoner of war experience. The commingling was brief. It happened aboard the ships that took them to North America, and I think maybe at 3 different camps there was some commingling. But the authorities realized pretty quickly that there would be deaths if they let these people together. And so, within days of their arrival, they were segregated. As you pointed out, there were these sort of like horrific incidents, some which didn't even make it into the film. There were fights, sort of like massive brawls that broke out in 1 or 2 camps between Jews and these Nazi prisoners of war. So it would have been very tense, very traumatic, especially for people who had been in Nazi camps before they ended up in Sherbrooke. It must have been mind-boggling to them to be in that situation. Yeah.
I love the cinematography in your film, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about the choices you made to film spaces, the choices you made to sort of have the film breathe and have us linger in nature, and then also just sort of looking at former buildings or vestigial evidence of buildings like concrete pilings and things like that.
I was definitely thinking of Chantal Ackerman's work in that context. There's a shot in the film that the camera sort of rotates 360 degrees over the course of maybe 10 minutes or so. And there, I was sort of thinking about this structural filmmaker named Michael Snow, who made a film in Canada that is just about a camera sort of like rotating slowly in like the Canadian tundra. And I sort of wanted to connect, this formal aspect of the filmmaking to an avant-garde tradition, and also to a Canadian avant-garde tradition. And for me, I guess during the making of this film, I was really interested in sort of like wider angles, and so large spaces filmed at like incredibly wide shots. Was interesting to me because this was before the pandemic. I had this idea that being on a large screen and people sort of being absorbed into the space. But I was sort of fascinated by that type of angle. And then when I started filming with Muhammed, I realized I wanted to visually connect his segments with the segments in the camp. So I think it's oftentimes people film interviews these days that are very tight, and it brings you really close into their faces. You're able to see sort of like every like twitch of emotion, every memory sort of like flash across their face. And for me, I think that is misleading. I think that oftentimes we hear a lot about sort of intimacy in filmmaking, and I think a lot of times that just comes to mean close-ups, and filming people in close-up, and like that's visually sort of how intimacy is represented. And one thing I wanted to make clear is that audiences in this film, and even myself, like actually do not have access to Muhammad's story. Right? He tells it, but the sort of like emotional content that travels with him is not ours, and it's not ours to access. So I wanted to film those interviews at kind of a remove to like visually indicate that we're listening to him, but we're not in him. We're not in his mind. We're not in his space. And I think in that way, visually it connects also to the camps. We weren't there. There's nothing to see left. Almost every single person who was in these camps is dead. There's very little that we can access, and it was important to me to sort of represent that visually too.
I thought you did an amazing job. I felt like it allowed us to sort of think and to breathe with your main subjects. So I wanted to ask what was the most surprising thing you learned by making this film?
Surprising thing. I guess I would say the history of the Canadian far right. Actually, the story of the internment camps is obviously incredibly compelling. But the extent of sort of like the fascist presence in Canada leading up to World War II is unbelievably upsetting and disturbing. There was a fascist party that used the swastika as their logo, surrounded by two beavers. It was a small but significant element of Canadian and especially Quebec life. The connection between Quebec separatism and Quebec nationalism and xenophobia and anti-Semitism is a thing that I think is often forgotten. And the links between these movements in Quebec for Quebec independence have a reactionary character, a reactionary root that I think we see springing up again in Canada. Just as we have these alt-right groups in the United States, they have the same thing, but they're infused with a separatist quality as well. That I think is goes back a long ways. Even if the groups themselves are not descendants from those original. The ideas are still alive, and we often think about Canada as being warm and welcoming. They certainly have a much better record than the United States does on refugee resettlement. But that doesn't mean there aren't problems. And sort of coming face to face with that, I think was probably the most revelatory for me.
Yeah, I'm sure you discovered some things you weren't aware of. To me, I think I often think of the separatist movement in Canada as being a progressive or being associated with sort of revolutionary movements that started, let's say, in France or in other places in the 1960s. Or I think about it as part of a global movement for self-determination in some way. And then to learn more about the right-wing parties there was very interesting. So I just have one last question. Thank you so much for talking to us. So what's your next project, or what are you working on now?
I've actually been roped into a podcast series. That's going to be the next thing. And it's about Irish American identity and the support group for the Irish Republican Army in the United States.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
That sounds great. Can you say what platform it'll be available on? Or
not that far along yet. It'll be on I think on most podcast apps for sure.
Great. Well, great. Keep us posted. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a beautiful film, and it's in addition to telling a story we didn't know much about. It's really artfully told. So congratulations.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And enjoy your hot day.
Thank you.
All right.